Before we begin, if you enjoy wandering through the dimly lit corridors of history with a touch of dark humor and the occasional unsettling whisper, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions. Here, the stories are just boring enough to lull you into a false sense of security, until they aren't. Chapter 1. The midnight shift begins. The clock struck midnight, and the plague hospital exhaled. Not a sigh of relief, not a groan of exhaustion, but something in between. A slow, rattling breath, as if the building itself was sick. By day, the place was a symphony of misery. The clatter of carts, the wails of the afflicted, the barked orders of surgeons who smelled of vinegar and desperation. But at night, the music changed. The notes were softer, slower, the kind of quiet that made your ears ring just to fill the silence. This was when the real work began. I adjusted my beak mask. Not that it did much, but the vinegar-soaked sponge inside at least drowned out the stench of rotting flesh and despair. My boots clicked against the stone floor, the sound too loud, like I was disturbing something that ought to have been left alone. The ward stretched ahead, a sea of cots where bodies twisted under thin, stained sheets. Some slept, some pretended to. Some had stopped doing either hours ago, and it would be my job to notice the difference before sunrise. The night shift was a peculiar kind of hell. Not the fiery, dramatic sort with screams and gnashing of teeth, but the kind where time stretched like taffy, sticky and endless. You check a pulse, find none, mark the bed for the morning cart, and move on. No fanfare. No one left to mourn. Just another name crossed off a list no one would read twice. At the far end of the hall, a candle flickered. Sister Matilda was already there, her habit as crisp as if it hadn't been soaked in sweat and fear for the last 12 hours. She didn't look up when I approached, just handed me a ledger thick with names and dates, half of them already scratched out and ready. 3 new admissions, she murmured. 2 in the west wing, 1 in the east. The east one's a talker. Fair warning. I nodded. Talkers were the worst. Not the delirious ones. Those were easy. They babbled about angels or demons or long-dead relatives, and you could nod and pretend to listen while counting the minutes until they passed out. No, the real problem was the lucid ones. The ones who knew exactly where they were and what was coming. They'd look you in the eye and ask questions you had no answers for. How long do I have? Will it hurt? Can you send for my wife? Elise. The west wing was quiet. 2 new arrivals, both already asleep or unconscious, their skin waxy in the candlelight. I checked their pulses, steady for now, and moved on. The east wing was worse. The talker was a man in his 30s, propped up on his elbows like he was waiting for a dinner invitation. His eyes locked onto mine the moment I stepped through the archway. "Ah," he said. "The bird-faced reaper, come to check my temperature, my expiration date. Dark humor. A bad sign." The ones who joked were the ones who hadn't accepted it yet. "Temperature," I said, pulling out a vial of mercury that would tell me exactly nothing useful. He held out his wrist and I noted the buboes under his sleeve, purple and angry. He followed my gaze. "That bad?" I didn't answer. There was no point. Instead, I handed him a cup of watered wine, enough to dull the pain, not enough to waste supplies. He drank it in one gulp, and grinned. "You know, I always thought I'd go in battle, or in bed with a beautiful woman, not like this." "Most people don't think it'll be like this," I said. He laughed, then coughed, then laughed again. "Fair enough." I left him there, still chuckling to himself, and returned to the ledger. 3 names added. By morning, at least 1 would be crossed out. Such was the night shift. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and somewhere in the dark, a cart creaked its way toward the pits. The hospital breathed again, slow and steady, waiting for dawn. But dawn was a long way off. Chapter 2. The Smell of Death and Disinfectant. The first thing you noticed wasn't the moans, the shuffling feet, or even the sight of bodies curled in on themselves like dying insects. No, it was the smell. It hit you the moment you stepped inside. A wall of rot and vinegar, of blood and burning herbs, of sweat and something sweetly putrid that clung to the back of your throat long after you left. Plague hospitals smelled like hope and failure mixed together. Sister Matilda used to say the stench was God's way of reminding us we were still alive. If that was true, then God had a cruel sense of humor. The air was thick with it, layers upon layers of suffering. The sickly sweet decay of gangrenous flesh. The metallic tang of blood-soaked bandages left too long in a bucket. The sharp, nose-searing reek of lye and vinegar, slopped across floors and walls in a futile attempt to scrub away the sickness. And beneath it all, the unmistakable musk of fear, sour and persistent. The worst part was how quickly you got used to it. By my third night on the ward, I barely noticed it anymore. That was the real horror, wasn't it? Not the grotesque sights, those at least you could turn away from, but the smell seeped into your clothes, your hair, your skin. You carried it home with you. You dreamed in it. And when you woke, it was still there, as if the hospital had followed you into your bed. Tonight, though, something was different. There was a new note in the symphony of stench, something sharper, more acrid. I found its source in the far corner of the ward, where a physician, or what passed for one these days, was burning a bundle of herbs over a brazier. The smoke curled upward in thick, choking tendrils, smelling like crushed rosemary and desperation. "What in God's name is that?" I asked, waving a hand in front of my face. The physician, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and a stained leather apron, didn't look up. "Purifying the air," he muttered. "Prevents miasma." I coughed. "It also prevents breathing." He shrugged, as if that were an acceptable trade-off. I left him to his fumigation and made my rounds. The patients had their own ways of coping with the smell. Some clutched sachets of lavender or cloves to their noses. Others simply breathed through their mouths, their expressions vacant, as if they'd already resigned themselves to the idea that this was how the world smelled now. One man, a merchant by the look of his fine but now filthy coat, was trying to bribe me for a vial of rosewater. "A drop on the wrist, just to cover the stink," he pleaded, pressing a coin into my palm. I gave him back the coin and handed him a rag soaked in vinegar instead. "Rub it under your nose. It won't help, but you'll smell something different for a while." He stared at the rag like I'd handed him a dead rat. Further down the row, a woman was singing softly to herself, a lullaby from the countryside. Her fingers traced patterns in the air, as if conducting some invisible orchestra. The smell didn't seem to bother her. Then again, neither did the buboes darkening her neck. She was too far gone for that. I checked her pulse, weak but steady, and moved on. Near the door, a pair of orderlies were wrestling a corpse into a shroud. The dead never smelled like the living. There was a hollowness to it, a stale finality. This one was fresh enough that the rot hadn't set in yet, but the sourness of sickness still clung to him. They rolled him onto the canvas, and a puff of air escaped his lungs, carrying with it the last breath he'd ever drawn. It smelled like cloves. Someone had tried to mask the death right up until the end. The orderlies heaved the body onto a cart and wiped their hands on their aprons. One of them caught my eye and shrugged. "Better out than in." I didn't answer. There wasn't much to say. By the time I reached the end of the ward, my eyes were watering from the smoke. The physician was still at his brazier, tossing in more herbs like a chef seasoning a stew. The air was practically soup now, thick enough to chew. I coughed into my sleeve. "Any chance you could ease up on the purification?" He gave me a look that suggested I'd just insulted his cooking. "Miasma theory is settled science. So is suffocation." He ignored me. I left him to his work and stepped outside for a breath of air that didn't taste like burning rosemary. The night was cool, the breeze carrying the damp scent of the river. For a moment I just stood there, letting it wash over me, pretending I could smell something else. Grass, maybe, or bread baking, or rain. Anything but the hospital. But the stench followed me, clinging to my clothes, my skin, my lungs. I took one last deep breath of the night air and went back inside. The hospital waited, breathing its slow, rotten breath. And the work went on. Chapter 3. Lanterns and Shadows. Light was a rare commodity in the plague hospital after dark. The candles were rationed, the oil too precious to waste on anything but the most essential tasks. And so the night shift unfolded in a dim, flickering half-world, where shapes moved just beyond the edges of vision. The lanterns we carried did little more than push the darkness back a few feet, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched and twisted like restless spirits. It made the simplest things unsettling. A cloak hanging on a hook became a lurking figure. A breeze through a cracked window turned into a whisper from the unseen. I adjusted the wick on my lantern, raising it higher as I walked the length of the ward. The light swayed, sending ripples of illumination across the floor, revealing a pair of feet sticking out from beneath a blanket, toes curled inward like claws. Further down, a hand twitched in the gloom, fingers flexing as if grasping at something only the dying could see. The shadows between the cots were deep enough to drown in. Sister Matilda moved through them like she was part of the darkness herself, her black habit blending seamlessly into the gloom. Only her face caught the light, pale and sharp, her eyes reflecting the flame like a cat's. She didn't carry a lantern. She never needed one. "You're late," she said, though her voice held no real accusation. Time was fluid here. Late and early were the same thing when the night stretched on forever. "Had to argue with the miasma enthusiast again," I said. "He's burning half the herb garden tonight." She made a noise that might have been a laugh or a sigh. "Let him. It won't make a difference, but it keeps him occupied." A groan echoed from the far end of the ward, followed by a wet, rattling cough. The sound seemed to slither through the darkness, lingering in the air long after it should have faded. I turned my lantern toward it, but the light didn't reach far enough to reveal the source. "That's the new one," Mathilde said. "Came in just before dusk. A baker, I think, or a butcher. Something with flour or blood on his sleeves." I moved toward the sound, the lantern swinging in my hand. The shadows it cast leapt ahead of me, stretching across the floor like fingers reaching for the sick man's cot. When I finally reached him, the light fell across his face, a face already sunken, the skin stretched tight over his skull, his lips cracked and bleeding. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but he didn't seem to see it. "Water," he croaked. I set the lantern down and reached for the pitcher beside his bed. The water was warm and stale, but he drank it greedily, his throat working like a pump. When he finished, he collapsed back onto the thin mattress, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Am I dying?" he asked. The question hung in the air between us, heavy and inevitable. I could have lied. Some of the others did, spinning tales of recovery, of miracles, of God's mercy. But the darkness made honesty easier. There was no point in pretty lies when the shadows were so close. "Probably," I said. He closed his eyes. I left him there, the lantern light retreating as I stepped away, leaving him once more to the dark. Further down the ward, something moved, a flicker of motion at the edge of the light. I turned, lifting the lantern higher. But there was nothing there, just the shadows, shifting and restless. "You see them too, don't you?" The voice came from a cot to my left. The woman lying there was propped up on one elbow, her eyes bright with fever or insight. She was young, or had been once. Now her hair was matted with sweat, her skin sallow in the lamplight. "See what?" I asked. "The others," she said. "The ones who don't stay in their beds." I followed her gaze to the empty space between the cots, where the darkness pooled like ink. "There's no one there." She smiled, a thin, knowing thing. Not anymore. A chill crept up my spine, but I ignored it. The night shift played tricks on the mind. The lack of sleep, the constant smell of death, the way the lantern light made everything feel like a half-remembered dream. It was enough to make anyone imagine things. Still, as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had moved in the darkness behind me. Something that didn't belong. I found Mathilde near the entrance, counting vials of something that smelled like turpentine and regret. "Did we lose anyone?" she asked without looking up. "Not yet," I said. "But the baker's close." She nodded, as if she'd already known. Maybe she had. Mathilde had a way of sensing death before it arrived, like a sailor feeling a storm in the air. I set my lantern down beside hers, the twin flames casting overlapping circles of light that pushed the shadows back, just for a moment. Outside the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, and the darkness beyond the windows felt alive, watching. "Do you ever think they're still here?" I asked. Mathilde didn't pause in her counting. "Oh, the dead." She finally looked up, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Of course they are. Where else would they go?" A gust of wind extinguished one of the lanterns, plunging half the room back into shadow. The remaining flame flickered wildly, sending shapes dancing across the walls, long-limbed, twisting, here and gone in a heartbeat. Mathilde didn't seem to notice. She simply relit the dead lantern and went back to her vials. And the night wore on, the lanterns burning low, the shadows growing longer. Somewhere in the dark, someone coughed. Somewhere else, something sighed. And the work went on. Chapter 4. The Relentless Coughing Chorus. Silence was the rarest commodity in the plague ward. It wasn't just the coughing, though there was always coughing, a relentless percussion section of wet hacks and dry wheezes that never quite synchronized but never stopped either. It was the moans that curled around the coughs like vines, the whimpers that punctuated them, the occasional sharp cry when someone moved wrong or remembered where they were. And beneath it all, when you listened close enough, the gurgling sighs of those who wouldn't see morning. Taken together, it formed a kind of music, morbid and improvisational, that played continuously from dusk till dawn. The baker was leading the chorus tonight. His coughs had taken on a rhythmic quality, deep and shuddering, like a bellows forcing air through rotten leather. Between fits he'd whisper numbers under his breath, counting seconds maybe, or keeping track of something only he could see. 37. Cough. 38. Cough. The numbers climbed steadily, even as his breath grew shallower. 2 cots over, the merchant who'd asked for rosewater had developed a new trick. Every exhalation came with a thin, reedy whistle, like a tea kettle left too long on the fire. It rose above the general din, whenever he turned his head just so. Earlier, I'd caught one of the orderlies mimicking it under his breath as he changed bandages, until Sister Mathilde fixed him with a look that could curdle milk. The worst weren't the loud ones, though. The worst were the patients who tried to stifle their coughs, pressing fists or rags against their mouths, as if good manners could somehow convince the plague to leave politely. You'd see their shoulders hunch with suppressed convulsions, their faces going red and gray with the effort, only for it to burst out anyway, twice as violent for being delayed. "Let it out," I told a young woman, barely more than a girl, who was doing this particular dance of denial. "You'll choke yourself otherwise." She shook her head violently, eyes wide with something beyond fear, shame maybe. When the cough finally won, it brought up a splatter of something dark that she hurriedly wiped away with her sleeve. A new sound joined the orchestra then, a thick liquid rattle from the far corner. I didn't need to look to know what it was. Neither did Mathilde, though she crossed herself before moving toward it. Some of the younger nurses claimed you could predict death by the sounds. The rattle meant minutes left. A sudden silence might mean hours. Personally, I thought it was all superstition. The plague took people when it damn well pleased, with or without musical accompaniment. The counting baker reached 63 before his rhythm broke into jagged, gasping coughs. When they subsided, he started again at 1. I wondered what happened when he reached 100. Would he start over? Would the numbers keep climbing as his body failed? Would anyone be listening when he finally ran out? A particularly violent fit from the merchant's cot produced a sound like a goose being strangled, which set off a chain reaction down the line. Someone whimpered. Someone else cursed. A third voice started praying in rapid Latin. For one absurd moment, it reminded me of my uncle's aviary. How one startled bird could set the whole flock to screeching. Here, Matilda materialized at my elbow with a clay cup. The liquid inside smelled like honey and something earthy. For the girl, it won't stop the cough, but it'll dull the edge. The girl drank it without protest, her fingers shaking around the cup. When she finished, she managed a whisper. Will it be quiet soon? I thought of all the answers I could give, the comforting lies, the harsh truths, the clinical explanations about lung tissue and phlegm. What came out was eventually, because that much was true. One way or another, the coughing always stopped. The ward's cacophony ebbed and flowed through the night like tide against a rotten pier. The baker's counting grew slower, the numbers stretching further apart. The merchant's whistle developed an occasional hiccup. Someone near the door began snoring in short, congested bursts that somehow cut through all other noise. Around what might have been midnight, clocks were pointless here. Time was measured in coughs and candle stubs. A new sound emerged, singing. Not the half-delirious humming of fevered dreams, but clear, purposeful notes from the cot of the woman who'd spoken of the ones who don't stay in their beds. Her voice was surprisingly strong, weaving through the ward's dissonance with an old folk tune about willow trees and lost love. For a few minutes something like peace settled over the ward. Even the baker paused his counting. Then the song broke off mid-verse with a gasp, followed by the unmistakable sound of retching. The moment passed. By the time the first gray light touched the high windows, the chorus had changed key. The baker had stopped counting at 79. The whistling merchant was down to shallow, irregular breaths. The singing woman was asleep or unconscious, her breath bubbling ominously with each exhale. Matilda and I met by the medicine cabinet, both of us moving like marionettes with half their strings cut. She handed me a tin cup of something bitter and bracing. Tomorrow night, I said, remind me to bring wax for my ears. She snorted. Wouldn't help. You'd still feel it in your teeth. A particularly wet cough echoed from the far end of the ward, followed by a groan. Then a muttered prayer. The night's final movement was beginning, and the work went on. Chapter 5. The Plague Doctor's Mask. Fashion or function? The first time I saw a plague doctor's mask up close, I laughed. It was impossible not to. The thing looked like something a drunken tinker had cobbled together after a nightmare about birds. A long, curved beak that jutted out nearly half a foot, round glass eyes that magnified the wearer's gaze to comical proportions, and leather straps that dug into the skin with the single-minded determination of a predator. The whole contraption made the wearer look like a cross between a crow and a disappointed grandmother. When I was forced to wear one, I stopped laughing. The theory behind the mask was sound enough, in the way that all medical theories of our age are sound, which is to say, not at all, but with great conviction. The beak was meant to be stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices, lavender, cloves, rose petals, anything pungent enough to overpower the stench of death. This would purify the foul air before it reached the doctor's lungs, and thus, in theory, prevent infection. In practice, it meant you spent your shift with your nose pressed against a rapidly wilting bouquet that did nothing for the smell, but made you sneeze constantly. The glass eyes fogged up at the worst possible moments. The leather straps chafed, and the beak itself had an unfortunate tendency to get caught on things. Bed frames, curtain ties, the occasional patient's grasping hand. More than once I bent down to check a pulse, only to have the mask's tip jab the poor sufferer in the face, which at least gave them something new to complain about before they died. Sister Matilda refused to wear one. "God gave me a nose," she said. "If he wanted me to stick flowers in it, he'd have made me a vase." The other doctors varied in their dedication to the fashion. Old Dr. Moreau wore his with solemn dignity, as if the ridiculous thing were a holy relic. Young Dr. Laurent had bedazzled his with what looked like scavenged jewelry, tiny mirrors and bits of colored glass that made him shimmer when he moved, which would have been charming if it didn't also make him look like a myopic magpie. Then there was Dr. Villette. Dr. Villette didn't just wear his plague mask, he performed in it. He'd stride through the wards with the dramatic flair of a stage actor, his gloved hands gesturing grandly as he dispensed diagnoses and dubious remedies. His mask was custom-made, the beak longer and more exaggerated than the standard issue, the eye holes rimmed with brass that caught the candlelight. Rumor had it he slept in the thing. "Observe," he announced one evening, sweeping into the ward like a particularly pretentious storm cloud. "The miasmatic humors are particularly concentrated near the windows tonight. We must counteract them with stronger aromatics." With that, he produced a handful of what appeared to be kitchen spices from his robe and tossed them onto the nearest brazier. The resulting smoke smelled like someone had set fire to a pie. Half the ward started coughing harder. "It's working," Villette declared, ignoring the groans. "The noxious vapors are being driven back." I watched as one particularly thick tendril of smoke drifted directly into the face of a sleeping patient who woke with a strangled gasp. "Truly remarkable," I said. "I think you just cured that man of breathing." Villette either didn't catch the sarcasm or chose to ignore it. "The mask," he intoned, tapping his beaked visage, "is our greatest weapon against the pestilence. Without its protection, we are but lambs before the slaughter." From across the room, Sister Mathilde made a noise that sounded suspiciously like a snort. The truth was, the masks did precisely nothing to prevent the spread of disease. We knew this because the doctors who wore them died at the same rate as those who didn't, sometimes faster if they tripped over their own beaks in the dark. But people believed in them, and in times like these, belief was sometimes the only medicine we had. The masks made the healthy feel safer. They gave the dying something to focus on besides their own failing bodies. There was power in the theatrics of it, in the way the blank, bird-like gaze turned the wearer into something more and less than human. Not a person who might catch your illness, but a symbol of the fight against it. Late one night, I caught one of the younger nurses adjusting her makeshift mask, a handkerchief stuffed with crushed mint tied over her face. "Does it help?" I asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. "But it makes the children less afraid when I lean close." That, I supposed, was something. Dr. Villette's theatrics reached their peak during the weekly bleeding ceremonies, where he'd don a fresh mask, black this time, for solemnity, and perform elaborate incisions while lecturing on the balance of humors. His patients died no slower for it, but they did so with the comforting knowledge that they'd received the very latest in pointless medical fashion. The masks came off at dawn when the shift changed, and we could finally scratch the strap marks on our faces. Mine left a permanent red line across the bridge of my nose that no amount of scrubbing would erase. Dr. Moreau's beard had grown to accommodate the shape of his, forming a peculiar duck-like silhouette even when unmasked. As for Villette, no one had actually seen his bare face in living memory. "Maybe he's hideous under there," one of the orderlies mused. "Maybe there's nothing under there," another countered. Personally, I didn't care to find out. The masks did have one unanticipated benefit. They were excellent for hiding expressions. When yet another miracle cure proved useless, when another child slipped away unnoticed, when the weight of it all threatened to show on our faces, the beaks kept our secrets. The patients could project whatever they needed onto those blank leather faces: hope, reassurance, divine judgment. And when the worst happened, when the coughing stopped for good and the sheet was drawn up, at least the dead were spared the sight of our relief. The work went on. Chapter 6, Herbs, Leeches, and Other Useless Remedies. If the plague hospital had a patron saint, it would have been the well-intentioned fool. Every morning brought fresh miracles of medical absurdity, each more elaborate and pointless than the last. The apothecary shelves groaned under the weight of tinctures that smelled like regret and potions the color of bad decisions. We had powders that made patients sneeze until they wept, salves that turned the skin interesting shades of green, and at least 3 varieties of enema that everyone pretended not to know about. None of it worked, but we administered it all with solemn ceremony, as if the sheer volume of our nonsense might somehow outweigh reality. Dr. Villette was particularly fond of a remedy involving crushed emeralds and goat's milk. The humors respond to precious stones, he explained to a wheezing merchant one evening, stirring a murky green slurry with what might have been a spoon or possibly a small fencing foil. The finer the gem, the greater the balancing effect. The merchant, to his credit, looked dubious even through his fever haze. "How much?" he croaked. "For you, 30 ducats. I watched as the man calculated how many weeks of life 30 ducats might buy him. "Will it work?" Villette didn't blink. "It can't hurt." This was the great lie we all told. It couldn't hurt. Except, of course, when it did. The bleeding bowls left patients weak and woozy. The purgatives dehydrated those already struggling to keep down water. The cleansing smokes made entire wards cough until they retched. But we persisted because the alternative was standing empty-handed at bedsides, watching people die without even pretending to help. Sister Mathilde had her own arsenal of useless comforts. Her specialty was poultices, great reeking mounds of herbs, and God knew what that she applied with the grim determination of a mason building a fortress against death. They did nothing for the plague, but they did leave interesting circular burns on the skin, which at least gave patients something new to examine as they declined. Lungvart, she'd mutter, slapping a greenish mass onto some poor soul's chest. "For the congestion." "Isn't lungwort just named that because the leaves look like lungs?" I asked once. She fixed me with a look that could have curdled milk. Sympathetic magic is still magic. The real magic was how quickly people would believe anything when they were desperate enough. I saw a wealthy widow pay 6 silver pieces for a unicorn horn that was clearly a carved narwhal tooth. A young mother rubbed her baby's gums with a paste of crushed pearls and honey because someone told her it would prevent infection. Even the educated ones, the merchants and minor nobles, would clutch at any straw offered, drinking mercury-laced water, wearing amulets stuffed with arsenic, sitting for hours in medicinal smoke so thick it made their eyes bleed. The leeches were my personal favorite. We kept them in great glass jars by the west window, where they could bask in the afternoon sun like tiny, lazy nobles. Dr. Laurent was particularly fond of them, applying the sluggish creatures to any patch of unbroken skin he could find. They balanced the blood, he'd say, as if anyone actually believed that anymore. I once watched him cover a delirious old man in 37 leeches, I counted, only to have the patient wake halfway through and start swatting at them like they were flies. The resulting scene, with leeches flying in all directions and Laurent diving after them like a man chasing his runaway hat, would have been comedy gold if not for the old man dying 2 hours later anyway. The remedies grew more creative as the plague dragged on. When the standard herbs ran low, we improvised. Someone suggested crushed rose petals might work as well as saffron. They didn't, but they did turn the patients faintly pink when they sweated. A traveling barber swore by a mixture of honey and crushed ants, which at least gave the sufferers something to complain about besides the plague. One, particularly enterprising, noon started selling vials of saint's breath. Ordinary air trapped in a bottle near a relic, going for a penny a sniff. The only thing that actually seemed to help was the wine. Not as medicine, of course, but as comfort. A cup of decent red could ease a patient's nerves, soften the edges of their pain, make the endless coughing fits slightly more bearable. We rationed it carefully. Too much and they'd choke. Too little and they'd remember where they were. But I'd yet to meet a dying man who refused a final drink. Why do we bother? I asked Mathild one night, watching a young physician proudly demonstrate his latest invention, a brass helmet meant to align the cranial humors through a system of pulleys and scented candles. She didn't look up from grinding what appeared to be dried beetles into a powder. Would you rather tell them the truth? I thought about that. Thought about standing beside beds and saying, "There's nothing to be done. You'll be dead by morning." Thought about the hope that flickered in even the most hopeless cases when you handed them some ridiculous potion or applied another useless poultice. The helmet patient had started crying when the candles tipped over and set his hair on fire. "No," I admitted, "I suppose not." And so the charade continued. We prescribed garlic for the lungs and mint for the bowels and rosemary for the memory, though no one could explain why remembering better would help against the plague. We bled the weak and purged the frail, and covered the dying in patches of moldy bread because someone once swore it drew out the sickness. And when all else failed, when the last tincture had been poured and the final leech applied, we sat by their beds and held their hands and lied through our teeth about how much better they looked today. The work went on. Chapter 7. The Silent Watchers. Fatigue in the plague hospital wasn't measured in hours of sleep lost. Such accounting would have driven us mad. It was measured in the gradual erosion of speech, of movement, of the very will to blink. The nurses and orderlies who worked the endless nights moved through the wards like figures in a dream, their footsteps soundless, their voices worn down to whispers when they could muster words at all. They became shadows with hands, their exhaustion so profound, it seemed less a condition than a second skin. Sister Mathilde had stopped speaking entirely by the third week. She communicated now in gestures, a pointed finger toward a struggling patient, a tap on my elbow when a pulse needed checking, a slow shake of her head when the answer to any unspoken question was no. Her habit, once crisp and black, had taken on the grayish hue of ash, as if the fatigue were leaching the color from her. The other nuns followed her lead, their usual hymns and prayers, abandoned in favor of a mute, ceaseless procession from bed to bed. The orderlies were worse. They moved in a kind of daze, their faces slack with exhaustion, their eyes reflecting the candlelight in dull, glassy shards. I watched one man change the same bedpan 3 times in an hour, each time with the same methodical slowness, as if he'd forgotten he'd already done it. Another stood for nearly 10 minutes staring at a wall, a pile of soiled linens drooping in his arms, before someone gently guided him away. The only sounds they made were the occasional sighs, long, shuddering exhales that seemed to carry the weight of the wards with them. Newcomers to the night shift always ask questions at first. How do we tell when it's close? What do we do if someone starts bleeding? Why does that one smell like that? By the second week, they stopped. The answers didn't matter. The work was the same regardless. I found one of the younger nurses, a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, leaning against a wall near the linen closet, her eyes half-lidded, her breathing slow. At first I thought she was asleep on her feet, a skill we all learned eventually. Then I realized her hands were still moving, fingers working tirelessly at a knot in a rolled bandage, unpicking and retying it over and over without any sign of recognition. I touched her shoulder. She didn't startle, didn't even look up, just blinked once, slow as an owl, and kept working the knot. "You should sit," I said. She shook her head, the motion barely perceptible. I didn't argue. Sitting was dangerous. Sit down, and you might not get up again. The doctors at least had the luxury of occasional outbursts. A slammed ledger, a kicked stool, A muttered curse when another vial of something expensive and useless shattered on the floor. But even those flashes of energy were short-lived, snuffed out as quickly as they appeared. Dr. Laurent, normally so fastidious about his appearance, had stopped bothering to tie his hair back, letting it hang in lank, greasy strands around his face. Dr. Moreau had developed a tremor in his hands that made his usual bloodletting rituals twice as messy. Only Dr. Villette seemed immune to the exhaustion, though even his theatrics had grown quieter, his usual grand pronouncements reduced to half-hearted murmurs. He still wore his ridiculous mask, still prescribed his emerald dust and goat's milk, but the flair was gone. Now he shuffled rather than strode, his shoulders hunched as if under an invisible weight. The patients noticed. They always did. The ones still lucid enough to register their surroundings would watch us with wary eyes, tracking our movements like birds, sensing a storm. They knew what silence meant. Silence meant we'd seen too much. Silence meant we were running out of hope to offer. One night, a man grabbed my wrist as I passed his cot. His grip was weak, his fingers trembling, but his eyes were startlingly clear. "You don't talk anymore," he said. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. He nodded, as if I'd answered anyway, and let go. The dead were the quietest of all. No one wept for them anymore, not openly. The orderlies would come with their sacks and their carts, lift the bodies with the same detached efficiency as they lifted soiled linens, and carry them away. Sometimes they'd pause to cross themselves. Mostly they didn't. Near dawn, when the candle stubs guttered and the windows began to gray, I found Sister Mathilde standing by the door to the courtyard, her face tilted toward the weak light. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, her lips moving silently in what might have been a prayer or simply a tally of the night's losses. I joined her. We watched the light creep across the floor together, two silent figures in a world that had long since run out of words. And the work went on. Chapter 8. Midnight Confessions. The dying had a way of waiting until the darkest hours to unburden themselves. Perhaps it was the silence that loosened their tongues, or the way the flickering candlelight made the world beyond their beds seem less real. Whatever the reason, midnight was when the secrets came out, whispered confessions, mumbled regrets, the occasional bizarre declaration that left us wondering whether we'd heard correctly, or if the fever had finally taken their wits entirely. The first time it happened, I thought the man was delirious. He was a merchant, or had been before the plague reduced him to a shivering mound of blankets. His breathing had taken on that telltale wet rattle, the one that meant dawn would come too late for him, and I'd been about to move on when his hand shot out and grabbed my sleeve with surprising strength. "I buried it under the oak," he rasped, his eyes glassy but intent. "The one with the split trunk. Tell my wife." A cough interrupted him, but he shook it off. "Tell her it's under the roots. She'll know." I waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. Just released my sleeve and sank back into the pillows, his face relaxing as if a great weight had been lifted. He died 2 hours later, without another word, leaving me to wonder whether I'd just been entrusted with the location of a hidden fortune, or the burial site of a particularly beloved pet. After that, I started listening more carefully. Some confessions were heartbreaking in their simplicity. A young mother whispered apologies to children she'd never see grow up. An old soldier wept for a comrade he'd abandoned decades ago. A priest, one of our own, murmured a steady stream of sins so mundane I suspected he was making them up just to have something to repent for. Others were stranger. One woman insisted she'd been secretly poisoning her husband's mistress for years, only to conclude with apparent disappointment. It never seemed to do anything. A merchant's final words were, "The ledger is a lie," delivered with such gravity I almost asked which ledger before realizing it didn't matter. A baker spent his last breath describing in meticulous detail where he'd hidden a cache of saffron from his apprentices. Then there was the nobleman who waited until Sister Mathilde was bending over him to adjust his pillow before whispering, "I killed my brother." She didn't pause in her work. "Did you now?" Push him down the stairs. A wet cough. Twice. She plumped his pillow with the same steady hand she used for everything. "Well, that'll be between you and God soon enough." He seemed to find this comforting. Not all confessions were verbal. Some came in the form of objects pressed into our hands. A rusted key. A locket with a miniature portrait inside. A scrap of paper with names we couldn't read scrawled across it in shaking script. We accepted them all with the same solemn nods, pocketing the items to be disposed of later. Most would never reach their intended recipients, assuming there were any. The plague didn't care about unfinished business. Occasionally, the dying would try to bargain. These were the hardest to hear. "Please," a young woman gasped, clutching at my wrist. "Just let me see the sun rise one more time." I opened the window. She died in the gray half-light before dawn. A wealthy merchant offered me his entire fortune for a cup of water from his hometown's well. When I told him it was impossible, he offered double for me to lie and say it was from there. I filled a cup from the rain barrel outside and told him it came from the Alps. He died smiling. The children were the worst. They didn't confess sins or secrets, just fears. One little boy, no more than 6, held my hand tightly and whispered, "Will it hurt?" Until he fell asleep for the last time. A girl asked if her dog would remember her. Another wanted to know who would feed her pigeons. I lied to all of them. Dr. Villette claimed these deathbed confessions were the body's way of expelling corrupt humors through speech rather than sweat. Dr. Laurent thought it was the soul preparing itself for judgment. Sister Mathilde said it was just people being people. No one wanted to die with unfinished business, even if that business was confessing to stealing a neighbor's chicken 20 years ago. Presently, I thought it was simpler than that. When you're staring into the dark, it's natural to want to leave some proof you were here at all. A word, a name, a secret. Anything to say, yeah, I existed. I'm not simply dissuaded. Won't I soon? I'm not on the slith yet. And one night, a man with buboes so large they distorted the shape of his neck motioned me closer. I braced myself for another confession, another plea, another cryptic message for someone who would never receive it. Instead, he said, "Your hair is coming loose." I reached up automatically. It was. He nodded, satisfied, and closed his eyes. It was the most ordinary thing anyone had said to me in weeks. The confessions continued, of course. They always did. But after that, I found myself listening for the mundane as much as the profound. The comments about the weather, the complaints about the food, the simple observations that proved even in the shadow of death, life insisted on being ordinary right up until it wasn't. Near dawn, as I was checking on the baker who'd told me about the saffron, he stirred and opened his eyes. "You're still here," he murmured. "So are you," I said. He smiled faintly. "Not for long." Then, after a pause, the saffron was a lie. I just wanted someone to be disappointed in me one last time. I couldn't help it. I laughed. He died before sunrise, but I like to think he heard me. And the work went on. Chapter 9. The Rat's Shift. The moment the last human footsteps faded at nightfall, the true masters of the plague hospital began their work. You could hear them first, a skittering rustle in the corners, a dry scratching in the walls, the occasional soft thump of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Then came the eyes, tiny glittering points of reflected lamplight appearing in the shadows between beds, under tables, behind stacked crates of useless medicines. By the time the first brave scout ventured into the open, twitching nose testing the air, we had already lost. The rats owned the night. They weren't even afraid of us anymore. You'd see them perched on bedposts, licking their paws like tiny lords surveying their domain, or trotting down the center of the ward with all the purpose of physicians making rounds. The boldest would sit up on their hind legs and watch us work, whiskers twitching with what I swear was amusement, as if our feeble attempts at cleanliness were the most entertaining thing they'd seen all week. Sister Mathilde had given up trying to keep them out entirely. "They're here for the same reason we are," she said one night, watching a particularly fat specimen waddle past with a crust of bread in its jaws. Job security. The rats had their favorites among the patients. They could tell somehow who wouldn't last till morning, who wouldn't stir if they crept close. I once saw 3 of them waiting patiently beneath a dying man's cot, their little paws folded on their bellies, like mourners at a vigil. When his breathing stopped, they were on the bed before I could reach it, sniffing at his pockets with professional interest. I shooed them away, but not before one gave me a look of such profound disappointment, I actually felt guilty. We tried all the usual methods to deter them, of course. Traps snapped empty night after night. Poison disappeared without effect. If anything, it seemed to make them bolder. One of the younger nurses swore by a concoction of peppermint oil and crushed pepper, which did nothing to the rats but made the entire West Wing smell like a particularly aggressive pie. Dr. Villette claimed his plague mask frightened them. This was demonstrably untrue. I'd seen one try to nest in the beak while he dozed upright in a chair. The rats had their own hierarchy, their own routines. The largest, a grizzled veteran missing half its tail, held court near the food stores, dispensing favors and first rights to the best scraps. Younger males staged elaborate battles in the supply closet, their squeaks and thumps providing an incongruous soundtrack to the ward's misery. Mothers carried their pink, squirming pups from one hiding place to another, pausing only to glare at any human who came too close. They grew fat while we grew tired. One night, I caught an orderly feeding one, a little gray female with a crooked ear, bits of cheese from his own meager ration. When he saw me watching, he shrugged. "She's got babies in the wall," he said, as if this explained everything. Perhaps it did. The rats weren't our only nocturnal visitors. Roaches swarmed the latrines in such numbers you could hear their shells crunching underfoot. Beetles the size of thumbs lurked in the bandage bins. And once, memorably, an entire family of foxes had gotten in through a broken window and proceeded to turn the East Wing into their personal hunting ground, sending nurses screaming and rats fleeing in equal measure. But the rats remained our constant companions. They watched us from the rafters as we changed dressings. They sampled our medicines when we weren't looking. One particularly adventurous group developed a taste for laudanum and spent an entire night stumbling around in happy circles before passing out in a pile of unused poultices. They stole quills and nibbled on ledger edges, leaving behind tiny teeth marks that made the hospital's records look like they'd been chewed by very dedicated, very small accountants. And when we carried out the dead at dawn, the rats would pause in their activities to watch us pass, their dark eyes unreadable, their whiskers twitching. Waiting. The work went on. Chapter 10. The Weight of the Dead. The dead were always lighter than you expected. It shouldn't have been surprising. Life weighed more than anyone realized until it was gone. But every time I lifted a body, that same thought surfaced. How could something that had held so much pain, so much fear, so much breath and blood and being, now feel like little more than a sack of sticks and damp cloth? The removal process began in silence. We'd move through the wards with our lanterns turned low, checking pulses that weren't there, pressing fingers to wrists gone cold. The living pretended not to watch, turning their faces to the walls or feigning sleep as we passed. No one wanted to draw attention to themselves after dark. The orderlies handled most of it, their faces blank as they worked. They'd roll each body onto a sheet of canvas, never linen, which was too precious to burn, and tie the ends with the brisk efficiency of merchants bundling goods for market. Some were gentler than others. Old Tomas crossed himself before touching anyone, his lips moving in silent prayer as he worked. Young Jacques treated them all like sleeping children, tucking the edges around them as if to keep out the chill. Sister Matilda kept track in her ledger, though what use the numbers served beyond documenting our failure, I couldn't say. The count never went down. 10 one night, 15 the next, 8 after that. It didn't matter. The beds filled faster than we could empty them. The cart to the pits only ran at dawn, so we stacked the wrapped bundles in the courtyard like cordwood, piling them high enough that the first rays of sunlight would hit the topmost ones before the carters arrived. In winter, when the ground froze too hard for digging, we had to keep them in the old chapel until the thaw, the bodies growing less recognizable with each passing day. The rats followed us during these grim harvests, their noses twitching at the scent of death, their tiny paws leaving tracks in the blood that sometimes seeped through the canvas. We shooed them away when we could, but there were always more, their eyes glinting in the lamplight like scattered coins. Some deaths were messier than others. The bleeders left dark stains that spread across the sheets like blooming flowers. The ones who choked on their own fluid sometimes still dripped when lifted, forcing us to work quickly before the smell drew flies. The children we wrapped twice, as if the extra layer might somehow cushion their journey. No one spoke during these rituals. Words had abandoned us weeks ago. We communicated in nods and gestures, a lifted chin toward a bed that needed attention, a hand waved over a face to indicate another sheet required. The silence made it easier, in a way. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound hollow or cruel or absurd. Occasionally, a patient would wake during the process. Not truly dead, not yet, but close enough that the distinction barely mattered. They'd murmur something, a name, a plea, a fragment of prayer, and we'd pause, waiting to see if it was the last spark or a false alarm. Most times it was the former. We'd note the bed and return later, when the candle had fully guttered out. The living watched these exchanges with a terrible understanding in their eyes. They knew the dance by now. The checking, the waiting, the eventual removal. Some turned away when we passed their beds, as if avoiding our gaze might make them invisible to death. Others stared openly, their faces slack with exhaustion or fear, or something beyond either. Only the delirious didn't understand. They'd call out to the wrapped figures as we carried them past, asking where they were going, if they'd be back soon, whether they might bring some small comfort when they returned. We never answered. The truth served no one. By the time the cart arrived, we were usually numb with fatigue, our arms aching from lifting, our noses deadened to all but the strongest stenches. The carters never spoke either, just loaded their grim cargo with the practiced ease of men who'd done this too many times to count, their faces hidden beneath scarves soaked in vinegar and juniper. One morning, as dawn painted the courtyard in pale gold, I noticed Jacques lingering by the cart after the others had gone inside. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the stacked bundles, his hands hanging limp at his sides. Then, with a suddenness that startled me, he leaned down and whispered something to the nearest body before turning away. I never asked what he'd said. Some things are better left between a man and the dead. Inside, the wards were already stirring, the living coughing and groaning their way into another day. The empty beds would be filled by noon. The cycle would continue, and the work went on. Chapter 11. The Superstitious Rituals. Science had abandoned us long ago, leaving behind a vacuum quickly filled by charms, talismans, and rituals so elaborate they would have made a pagan priest blush. The plague hospital became a temple of superstition, its halls echoing with whispered incantations and the rustle of hidden amulets. We knew on some level that none of it worked. The proof lay wrapped in canvas in the courtyard every morning. But the illusion of control was the last comfort we had left. Sister Matilda, for all her practicality, kept a dried toad in her pocket. "It's for protection," she said when I caught her repositioning it one evening. She didn't specify what kind of protection, and I didn't ask. The thing looked like it had died confused. The orderlies had their own system. Before entering the wards each night, they'd line up by the door and touch a particular knot in the wood paneling, one after another, like children playing some grim game of tag. Miss the knot, and you might as well turn around and go home for all the good you'd that night. I once saw Jacques nearly trip over his own feet going back to touch it a second time after brushing it too lightly on his first attempt. Dr. Villette's entire existence had become one long ritual. He developed an elaborate dressing routine, involving exactly 13 folds of his plague mask straps, each accompanied by a murmured phrase in what might have been Latin, or might have been complete nonsense. The first time I witnessed this performance, it took him nearly 20 minutes to get the mask on, during which time 3 patients died unattended. When I pointed this out, he fixed me with a look of such wounded dignity, I almost apologized. The nurses favored more portable superstitions. One wore a necklace of garlic cloves that made her smell like a particularly anxious salad. Another carried a small mirror in her apron pocket, angled to reflect death's gaze whenever she bent over a patient. A third insisted on working only while holding her breath, an admirable dedication to the craft, if not to basic biology. Even the patients got in on the act. The wards were a symphony of clicking rosary beads and rattling rabbits' feet. You couldn't walk 3 steps without someone pressing a charm into your hands, or begging you to place some trinket under their pillow. The wealthier ones paid for blessings, from priests, from passing monks, from anyone who looked like they might have a halfway decent connection to the divine. I once saw a merchant's wife hand over a silver candlestick to a holy man who turned out to be a shoemaker's apprentice looking to make some extra coin. He blessed her with impressive enthusiasm. The oddest rituals belonged to the night cleaners. Between changing soiled linens and scrubbing blood from the floors, they'd perform an elaborate dance of avoidance around certain spots, stepping over a particular floorboard, circling a suspicious shadow 3 times, never emptying a bedpan without first spitting in it for luck. When questioned, they'd cite various tragedies that had befallen those who broke these rules, though the tragedies always seemed to involve some distant cousin's neighbor's uncle rather than anyone actually present. I told myself I was above such nonsense. Then one evening I found myself knocking on wood after a particularly difficult shift, and realized I'd become just as bad as the rest. After that, I stopped judging. Desperation made believers of us all. The herbs were the worst offenders. Every ward had its own signature stench from whatever aromatic blend was currently in fashion. Mint for purification, sage for protection, thyme for courage. The air was so thick with them you could taste the greenery on your tongue. When supplies ran low, people got creative. I once caught a nurse stuffing a patient's pillow with crushed rose hips and onion skins because she'd heard it warded off evil humors. The patient, to his credit, didn't complain, though whether this was due to politeness or impending death was unclear. Even our few remaining scientific practices had devolved into ritual. Bleeding was performed at precise lunar phases. Medicines were administered while reciting specific phrases. The leeches were fed on a strict schedule that allegedly made them more effective, though no one could explain how. The only thing everyone agreed on was that you never, ever said aloud that things might be improving. That was tempting fate in the worst possible way. When a patient actually recovered, a rare enough event that it still drew stares, we'd all pretend not to notice until they were safely out the door, lest some unseen force take offense and reverse the miracle. One night, as I watched a young orderly carefully arrange 12 pebbles around a dying man's bed, to confuse the death spirits, he explained, it struck me that none of us really believed these things work. Not deep down. But the alternative was admitting we were utterly powerless, and that was a thought too heavy to carry through the long nights. So we kept knocking on wood, kept counting our steps, kept whispering prayers to saints we weren't sure were listening. Because while the plague might not care about our rituals, we did. And the work went on. Chapter 12. The rare moments of levity. There is a particular kind of laughter that only blooms in darkness, a humor so black it would wither in sunlight. We cultivated it carefully in the plague hospital, passing jokes between us like contraband, savoring each inappropriate chuckle like a stolen sweet. It wasn't that we'd stopped caring, quite the opposite. The laughter was proof we hadn't yet broken entirely. The orderlies were the worst offenders. Their humor ran to the physical, as humor often does among men who haul bodies for a living. They'd mimic the death rattles of the newly departed with uncanny accuracy, turning it into a competition to see who could produce the most dramatic performance. Old Tamaha always won. His rendition of a consumptive nobleman's final breath, complete with fluttering hand gestures, had brought even Sister Mathilde to the edge of a smile once. The nurses preferred wordplay. They'd renamed the wards based on their current states. Saint Rattlings for the consumptive wing, Our Lady of Perpetual Vomiting for the dysentery cases. When a particularly pompous physician insisted his new treatment would surely work this time, they took to calling him Dr. Surely behind his back, until the nickname stuck so thoroughly even some patients used it. Dr. Villette was, predictably, immune to humor, though he unwittingly provided more material than anyone. His dramatic pronouncements and ridiculous mask made him a favorite target. The orderlies had developed an entire pantomime of his mannerisms, complete with exaggerated beak adjustments and sweeping, pointless gestures. They only performed it out of his sightline, of course. No one actually wanted to anger the man holding the leeches. My own contributions tended toward the observational. I'd keep track of the week's most absurd deaths. The merchant who expired mid-tirade about his rival's dishonest scales, the nun who died whispering a confession about stolen jam, and share them during the rare lulls. It wasn't kind, but kindness had left us months ago. The patients provided their own unintentional comedy. Delirium bred bizarre pronouncements, and we collected these like rare coins. One man spent his final hours convinced he was a loaf of bread, begging us not to slice him. Another conducted an elaborate argument with death himself, offering increasingly ridiculous bargains. "I'll give you my cousin's best goat." A third, upon being told he had perhaps an hour left, asked if that was enough time to learn Latin. Even the rats got in on the act. We'd named the boldest ones, Sir Nibbles, Lady Skitter, the Duke of Cheese, and invented elaborate backstories for their nightly escapades. The time a group of them dragged an entire loaf of bread into the linen closet became legend, retold with embellishments each time someone needed a distraction from the grim reality of our work. Sister Mathilde's humor was the driest of all. She could deliver a line so deadpan you weren't sure it was a joke until hours later, when you'd suddenly chuckle in the middle of changing a bandage. When a young nurse complained about the smell of a particular wound, Mathilde had merely nodded and said, "Ah, yes, the sweet perfume of our labors." The girl hadn't known whether to laugh or cry, which was precisely the point. The laughter wasn't constant. There were nights when the weight of it all pressed down too heavily, when the sounds of suffering drowned out any possibility of levity. But even then, someone would find a way. A raised eyebrow at an especially ridiculous deathbed confession, a muttered comment about Dr. Villette's latest miracle cure, even just an exaggerated sigh as yet another bed needed changing. It wasn't much, but in the long dark hours between midnight and dawn, it was enough. And the work went on. Perhaps the darkest joke of all was how normal it all began to feel. The routines, the rhythms, even the horrors, they became just another part of the night's work, as mundane as checking a pulse or changing a bandage. We joke about the smell, about the rats, about the increasingly bizarre cures being peddled at the hospital gates. We laugh at the absurdity of it all, at the sheer ridiculousness of trying to fight something we couldn't see or understand. And then we'd go back to work, because what else was there to do? The laughter didn't fix anything. It didn't save anyone. But it kept us sane, or something close to it. And in a place where sanity was in shorter supply than clean bandages, that was no small thing. And the work went on. Chapter 13. the dawn that brings no relief. Dawn in the plague hospital was not the golden respite poets described. The light crept in tarnished and reluctant, sliding across the floor like something ashamed to be seen. It revealed what the darkness had only hinted at: the stains on the walls, the hollows under patients' eyes, the slow accumulation of grime that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Morning brought no miracles here, only shift changes and ledgers, and the same suffering under a different light. The day staff arrived with the sun, their faces still puffy with sleep, their steps heavy with the knowledge of what awaited them. We night workers would nod at them as we passed in the doorway, neither group envying the other. Their days would be louder, busier, full of visitors and deliveries, and the endless stream of new patients. Our nights were quieter but longer, the hours stretching thin as old bandages. Neither was preferable. The handovers were brief affairs. Sister Matilda would point to beds that needed watching, list the night's deaths in that clipped tone of hers, mention any particularly difficult cases. The day nurses would sigh and roll their sleeves higher. The physicians would glance at the bodies still waiting to be carted away and make some comment about efficiency before retreating to their offices to drink whatever passed for coffee these days. I often lingered longer than I should have, watching as sunlight revealed the full extent of what we'd been battling in the dark. The man who'd been merely restless at midnight now thrashed with full fever. The woman whose cough had seemed manageable now struggled for each breath. The child who'd been sleeping peacefully was now still in a way that needed no explanation. The night hid our failures. Daylight displayed them mercilessly. The walk home was its own special torture. Emerging into a world that still functioned, where people argued about the price of eggs and children played in the streets, felt like stepping onto a stage after forgetting all your lines. I'd blink at the sunlight like some nocturnal creature unearthed, my stained clothes and hollow eyes drawing wary glances from those still lucky enough to fear the plague. My rooms offered little comfort. However much I scrubbed, the smell of the hospital clung to my skin. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and haunted. I'd dream of forgotten patients calling my name, of piles of linens that never stayed clean, of Sister Mathilde's voice listing names in an endless loop. Often I'd wake coughing, my hand flying to my neck to check for swelling that hadn't yet appeared. The worst were the days when I'd arrive for my shift to find my replacement hadn't come. Sometimes they were sick. Sometimes they'd fled. Sometimes they were just gone. No explanation offered or expected. On those days I'd turn around and walk back into the wards without bothering to remove my coat. What was another 12 hours when time had ceased to have meaning anyway? The truly cruel trick was how beautiful the mornings could sometimes be. How the light would catch the dust motes just so, turning them into floating gold. How the occasional breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers instead of rotting flesh. How the birds, oblivious to our suffering, sang the same songs they'd sung before the plague. These small beauties didn't comfort. They mocked. One such morning, as I stood watching the sunrise paint the courtyard in pinks and golds, Sister Mathilde joined me. We didn't speak, just watched as the carters loaded their grim cargo, their movements slow with their own exhaustion. The birds sang. Somewhere in the city, a church bell tolled. The world continued, indifferent. "Another day," she said at last. I nodded. Another day. And the work went on. The days blurred together, each dawn indistinguishable from the last. The numbers in the ledger rose. The herbs in our masks grew stale. The rats grew bolder. We moved through it all like sleepwalkers, our hands performing their tasks without need for conscious thought. Sometimes, in my rare moments of clarity, I wondered how much longer we could keep doing this. Then, another patient would cough, or another orderly would collapse from exhaustion, or another cart would arrive with fresh bodies to fill the empty beds, and the question would answer itself. There was no end in sight. Only dawn after dawn after dawn, each bringing not relief, but repetition. And the work went on. Chapter 14. The loneliness of the night worker. There is a particular solitude that comes with working the night shift in a plague hospital, a loneliness that has nothing to do with being physically alone, and everything to do with the unbridgeable distance between you and the sleeping world outside. While others dreamed in their beds, we moved through the wards like ghosts, our hands busy with tasks no one would thank us for, our eyes weary from watching what others refused to see. The city outside our walls continued its oblivious existence. Lovers whispered in moonlit courtyards. Drunks staggered home, singing off-key. Watchmen dozed at their posts. None of them knew, or wanted to know, about the silent drama unfolding behind our shuttered windows. Their ignorance was a luxury we could no longer afford. Even among the night's staff, loneliness persisted. We worked side by side for hours without speaking, passing each other in the corridors with nods instead of words. Conversation required energy we didn't have, and there was little left to say anyway. The same jokes had been told too many times. The same complaints had lost their edge. Silence became our common language, heavy with all the things we couldn't bring ourselves to voice. I tried writing letters to family at first, but gave up when I realized how little I could say. How do you describe this life to someone untouched by it? The words always came out wrong, either too clinical or too sentimental, never capturing the strange limbo we inhabited. Eventually I stopped trying, and the pile of unsent letters grew dusty in my room. The patients weren't company, not really. The conscious ones were too wrapped in their own suffering to care about ours, and the delirious spoke a language only they understood. We were shadows to them, useful but interchangeable, here to ease their pain or change their linens or, when all else failed, carry them away. Sister Matilde came closest to understanding, but even she maintained a careful distance. We might share a glance over a particularly difficult case, or exchange weary smiles when Dr. Villette launched into yet another lecture on humors. But these moments were fleeting. She had her faith to sustain her. I had nothing but the work. The worst were the brief interactions with the day staff during shift changes. Their world still had color in it. They spoke of market gossip and family squabbles, of new plays and old scandals. Their concerns seemed trivial compared to ours, but also unbearably precious. I'd listen to their chatter with a kind of detached wonder, like a prisoner hearing about life outside the walls. Walking home at dawn only emphasized the isolation. The waking city rushed past me, all purposeful strides and cheerful greetings, while I moved through it like a sleepwalker. People gave me wide berth, not just from fear of contagion, but from some instinctive recognition that I no longer belonged to their world. My hands smelled of vinegar, and my eyes carried shadows no sunlight could dispel. At the tavern near my rooms, the morning regulars would be starting their day as I ended mine. I'd sometimes sit in the corner nursing a mug of ale, listening to their easy laughter and meaningless arguments. They might as well have been on another continent. The loneliness changed you. It hollowed you out, left you strange and quiet and unfit for polite company. I found myself staring at normal people the way an anthropologist might study some foreign tribe, marveling at their ability to care about things like fashion or politics, or what to have for supper. Didn't they know? Didn't they understand how fragile it all was? One night, as I stood at the window watching a party spill out of a nearby house, all bright silks and drunken song, a hand tugged at my sleeve. One of the younger nurses stood there, her face pale in the lamplight. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, nodding toward the revelers. I looked at the wine stains on my shoes, the blood caked under my nails. "I don't remember how." She nodded, understanding. Neither of us spoke again that night. The work continued as it always did, and we moved through it like sleepwalkers, alone together in our shared nightmare. And the work went on. Chapter 15. The ones who walked away. No one ever left the night shift unchanged. Some left in canvas wrappings, carried out with the other nameless dead. Others vanished between shifts, their absence noted only when their replacements arrived. But a few, a stubborn, improbable few, walked out alive when their time was done, blinking like moles in the sunlight, their hands still twitching with the memory of work unfinished. We never said goodbye to the ones who left. It was bad luck, like whistling at night or mentioning a patient's improving color. Instead, we'd notice their empty spot at the hand-washing basin, their usual stool unoccupied in the apothecary corner. The missing would linger in those absences for a day, maybe two, before the space closed around itself like water after a sinking stone. Jacques was the first of our group to go. One evening he simply didn't appear for his shift. When asked, Sister Mathilde merely tapped the ledger where his name had been neatly crossed out. No explanation given, none needed. Months later I spotted him tending a market stall, his once lanky frame filled out, his eyes clear. Our gazes met across the crowd, and in that instant I saw the recognition flicker, then die as he deliberately turned away. Some doors, once closed, stay closed. Old Thomas lasted longer than any of us expected. He retired to a village upriver, or so the story went. The last I heard, he'd planted an orchard and refused to speak of his hospital years, though he still washed his hands compulsively before meal. The nurses dispersed like dandelion seeds. One married a widowed farmer. Another joined a convent far from play country. A third opened a tavern and reportedly poured the strongest drinks in the city. They left no forwarding addresses. Dr. Villette, to everyone's surprise, survived. He abandoned his plague mask after the crisis passed and reinvented himself as a specialist in gout treatments, though his cures remained as questionable as ever. I once attended one of his public lectures out of morbid curiosity. He spoke for an hour without ever mentioning those years, without acknowledging the few familiar faces in the crowd who remembered his nightly performances with the emerald dust. Some losses are too great to name. As for Sister Mathilde, she simply disappeared one winter morning. The order claimed she'd been transferred to a rural parish, but the timing coincided with the closure of the plague wards. I like to imagine her somewhere quiet, her hands finally still. Her ledgers closed for good. The hospital itself was scrubbed raw and converted into a wool warehouse. Merchants now haggle where patients once groaned. No plaque marks what happened there. No one speaks of it. The city has moved on with the frantic energy of survivors everywhere, as if speed alone could outpace memory. I remained longer than most, though I couldn't say why. Habit, perhaps, or the perverse pride of seeing a thing through to its bitter end. When the last ward closed, I stood in the empty courtyard as workmen whitewashed over the bloodstains, their brushes sweeping away the evidence as methodically as we'd once disposed of the dead. Now I walk the night streets like a ghost, my steps automatically avoiding the cracks where the cartwheels used to stick. Sometimes I catch the scent of vinegar or rotting flowers, and my hands twitch for missing bandages. Sometimes I wake gasping from dreams of forgotten patients calling my name. The strange thing is how little it all matters now. The terror, the exhaustion, the countless small horrors. They faded like stains in the rain. What lingers are the unimportant moments. The way the lamplight caught Sister Mathilde's profile as she counted supplies, the sound of Jacques humming off-key as he mopped, the particular squeak of the third stair on the west ward. These are the things that wake me in the dark. Not the deaths or the suffering, but the ordinary beauty we built between them. I never speak of those years. Like the others, I've learned some stories don't bear telling. But sometimes, when I meet another night walker's eyes across a crowded square, I see the recognition there. We nod almost imperceptibly and go our separate ways. The work, after all, is finally done.